So thank you very much for being here to this panel and for the patience in the, sort of moving around bits and pieces in our schedule. We've been talking about the developing brain the whole morning and what makes children grow and thrive and what doesn't make them thrive. And of course, this brief panel is not going to handle all the issues out there that have already emerged. But for us, this discussion is very important in order to really trying to outline some of the many systemic issues that we know from research really affect families and young children. We're talking about conflict, violence, the climate emergency, racism, poverty, and of course it's also very difficult to pick at them, as also Chuck Nelson was saying, one by one, as like a lot of them obviously interact together. But we want to try and tackle some of these difficult questions, looking at some of the research that is out there, the narratives that are being used to talk about these issues, but also to learn about some of the solutions, some of the ideas at least that we know can try and mitigate these issues. So we have a very fantastic panel here that I'm so glad that we've managed to assemble. And I'm not gonna read out your full bios because that's so boring and we've got them, but I will start by asking each of you about your specific expertise. And I wanna start with Kim there on the other side. Well, Kimberly Noble, MD, PhD, is a professor of neuroscience and education at Teachers College here at Columbia, and she's been studying how socioeconomic inequality affects children's cognitive and emotional and brain development for a very long time, broadly. And so I really want to start about, really hearing from you about how much the research tells us about really the effects of poverty on children's brain, how extensive it is, and what we know.
Great, thank you, Irina. So I think it might help to first start with some definitions. So, what do we mean when we're talking about poverty? So strictly speaking, poverty is defined as inadequate economic resources to have a basic standard of living. And of course, the exact definition is going to vary a lot based on which country or which organization is making the definition. So according to the World Bank, poverty globally is defined as living on less than $2.15 a day. Extreme poverty is less than $1.90 a day. Here in the U.S., the federal government sets the poverty line according to family size and composition, meaning the number of adults and children in the home. And currently, the official poverty line for a family of four is set at around $30,000 a year. What's interesting is that the official federal poverty line here in the U.S. doesn't vary based on where you live. So, a family of four living here in New York City has the same poverty line set for them as a family of four in rural Kansas, even though, of course, the cost of living is quite different in those places. And one other thing I'll note is that some researchers here at Columbia in the School of Social Work have developed the supplemental poverty measure, which does take into account things like government supports and social service benefits, which give perhaps a richer picture of the economic resources that a family has. So now to answer your question, Irena, we've known for a very long time that children facing poverty are at risk for a host of detrimental outcomes, right? Everything from lower school achievement to worse physical and mental health to lower likelihood of employment when kids grow up. And we've also been able to link poverty to specific cognitive and behavioral outcomes, right? So we commonly see associations with things like language and literacy, with learning and memory, and with executive function, or sort of the ability to regulate your thoughts and your behaviors. So all kinds of critical building blocks for succeeding in school. And we also have seen associations between family economic resources and the structure and function of brain circuits that support those distinct cognitive skills. Now we're in the process of working out what are the specific experiences associated with poverty that seem to account for these links, right? And you can likely think of many, right? Differences in nutrition, differences in access to high quality schools, differences in access to healthcare. The theme that I think we've heard many times today, differences in exposure to stress. Right? And just taking that one example, it's very clear, of course, that families with limited access to resources, that's an extremely stressful situation. We know that children facing poverty often have alterations in their body's response to stress. So the very biology of how we respond to stressful situations can change in situations of chronic stress. And the brain circuits that support critical building blocks of achievement, things like learning and memory and self-regulation, are themselves exquisitely responsive to stress. So stress can have a cascading effect on the body and brain and ultimately outcomes that we care about very much.
Thank you so much. That was very very brief and very to the point. I want to come to you, Brenda Jones-Harden, a professor at the Columbia School of Social Work now. Your research has looked at the developmental and mental health needs of young children who experience early adversity, and most recently has also focused on the effects of racial disparities, which of course is not separated from the previous previous work. You're a scientist and practitioner as well. And please tell us about the effects of the racial disparities on children. Of course, it's very hard to separate it from what some of what Kim has just gotten into, but we would love to focus on that.
Sure. The first thing I'll do is remind you all of Chuck's diagram. Remember, he had that beautiful tree diagram where he had all the family issues at the top, and then at the bottom he had these root causes. They call those adverse community exposures that really do lead to these ACEs. So I think one of the things that we've learned, and I'm ashamed to say that you're right, it is more recently that I've started to add race to my list of predictors. Usually they had been the sort of typical adversities that we hear about, that Chuck talked about, that Kim is talking about with poverty. But we do know, at least in the United States, and I would bet in some of your countries as well, that there is a high correlation between poverty and race, at least if you live in heterogeneous countries, right? Which a lot of Western nations are becoming heterogeneous because you got immigrants coming in, but the United States has lived with this for its entire life. And so what you see is a very high correlation between poverty and race in this country. So that many people argue that the reason you see these racial disparities has to do with poverty and the concomitant risks. I have my advisor from graduate school in my head who used to say, it's not just poverty and not just material hardship, it's all the things that go along with that, like Kim is talking about, the other kinds of stressors. So some people argue, at least in the US, that many of the racial disparities are because of poverty, but when you look at the data, actually there is some variability that is not explained by material hardship. So then you ask the question, what does that mean? Well, there's a guy named Williams who's a public health scientist in this country who says that racial disparities are at the core of many of our health disparities. So things like diabetes, hypertension, all these kinds of things that now the ACEs study is making us pay more attention to, right? I mean, we've known this for decades, right? Physicians have known it, mental health people have known it, but now we have brain pictures and things like that that help us to think about it. So now, somebody asked before about what were the policy implications of like what Chuck has done. Well, people like me take Chuck's and Kim's beautiful brain pictures and go speak before legislators and say, look at what they've been able to document because of the brain, and we get lots of money in early childhood, for example. And I am very clear that even though we've known this kind of stuff for decades, it's because of these kind of pictures that we've gotten this. But back to the issue of race, we're not quite there. people are willing to hear the poverty arguments and look at the brain stuff, but race is so complex, especially in a country like this when it's really rooted in things like slavery and what happened to the Native Americans. It's very touchy, very touchy. All you had to do is look at the, what's happening in our political world and you'll see that. But the data really do suggest that when you look at different groups, particularly African Americans, that there are these health and mental health disparities that are not just explained by poverty. So then you have to ask the question, well, what does that mean? You can look at structural racism, a lot of which has to do with poverty, but also things like community environments. Like Chuck talked about toxic environments. We know that poor children grow up in places where there are a lot more pollutants, where there's lead in the paint, all this kind of stuff. So we know that these environmental toxins really do affect kids' outcomes. But we also have this thing we call interpersonal racism, which has to do with the experiences you have on a day-to-day basis that come from microaggressions. A lot of the people who study race talk about that. Like, you walk into a room where you might be the only black person and nobody sits at your table, for example, right? That's a silly example, but these are the kind of microaggressions that people who study race report that end up causing just as much stress as what Kim was talking about. So what we know from the data is that racism leads to higher levels of stress, but what we know about children, at least young children, is that they don't quite get that the aggression is due to race. So, they kind of say that boy is being mean to me or something like that. But what happens is they vicariously experience racism through their parents. So what you see are things like greater rates of obesity. You see greater behavior problems if their parents report experiencing racism. Now, we can also think about even little kids, pre-verbal children. Think about structural racism. You all, if you've been paying attention at all to the American media, you will know that black babies, for example, have much higher rates of infant mortality in this country, regardless of socioeconomic status. So again, the poverty, it goes beyond just the poverty. Higher rates of morbidity, and they're saying that has to do with maternal physical health. For example, preeclampsia, all that kind of stuff, higher rates of hypertension, which we know is a big issue in the black community writ large. So some people have called it the weathering hypothesis with Jane and I. I just want to do a shout out to Jane West, who I know brought me here from the Two Lilies Fund. Thank you, Jane, for inviting me. But at any rate, we know that it's allostatic load. They call it this cross-generational allostatic load, historical trauma that you've experienced as a result of racism, right? That goes across the generation, that gets under the skin and affects your organs, right? So it makes you have hypertension, makes you more likely to have premature birth, all that kind of stuff. So that's one of the worst outcomes that we can attribute to racial practices. And there have been a lot of research about this in the medical community. They have found, for example, that in places where the OBGYN is the same race as the mother, that you see lower rates of infant mortality. So these are questions of implicit bias in the people who do the work, etc. But also on the psychological side, we have seen things like more difficulties in emotion regulation for children under 3 when their mothers have experienced discrimination. We just did a study that hopefully will be coming out in Infant Mental Health Journal, where we found that discrimination during pregnancy affected babies' maternal experiences of discrimination during pregnancy affected infants' developmental scores when they were 4 to 6 months of age. So again, this notion that the interpersonal racism that a parent might experience affects their stress and mental health, affects their parenting, which affects children's outcomes. So just a couple of examples.
Thank you so much, Brenda. And I guess, I mean, I always think of Serena Williams as a great
She's the
example
best example, yeah.
of someone who wasn't believed to have some problems during her pregnancy and has become very vocal at talking about these disparities.
She brought a lot of attention to that.
Yeah, yeah. Jill, I'm coming to you. You're not an academic researcher, but you've been a climate communicator for 2 decades. And now, as a co-founder of Our Kids Climate and the Climate Parent Fellowship Program, among other things, you've been working on this parent-led intergenerational work to really create different awareness around climate and how it affects young children and families. So, coming to you, what happens, what is the research that you've used more often in your communication to really explain how the climate emergency affects children and families more?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about the impact side first, and then hopefully we'll get to more questions later down the line, and I can talk more about like the communications and also especially around the solution side. And instead of going into any one specific piece of research, I thought I'd talk a little bit about how, as journalists, you might approach different frames or different ways of thinking about the impact of climate change on children. So one thing we definitely see is that there are direct impacts on children with extreme weather patterns. So whether it's heats or storms or floods, we know that that has impacts on communities and also has impacts on children. And I mean, we're looking at like some of the research that we look at within our organization comes out of like the WHO or UNICEF, Save the Children, the IPCC report. We're really looking at as practitioners and as communicators, like what does that research say, and then how do we use it to mobilize and engage people? And one of the things that my team put together, we did a piece on extreme heat, and we put a briefing together for other organizers and leaders around the globe, because often what happens, I think, in the climate space is that people are impacted by extreme weather events, but they're not necessarily ready to respond in terms of how that extreme weather event is related to what they're experiencing. And then we know with extreme weather events, if you let too much time pass, people are really interested in the moment and they're interested in making those connections. But then as time passes, there's kind of this psychological, almost like forgetting that these things happened. But we did do, when we put together a briefing on heat, and we went and interviewed a number of the people in our community, especially from places that were experiencing extreme heat. We learned that these kinds of ideas of like sometimes with statistics we get lost in the information, so we really have to kind of visualize what we're talking about. So in 2020, a child born in 2020 would experience 7 times as many heat waves and twice as many wildfires as their grandparents. So kind of taking that information and putting it into a way that people can actually imagine themselves, or they can imagine their own children and their own grandchildren in that frame. Another way we think about the frame is to connect the impact of climate change and the main cause of climate change, which is the burning of fossil fuels, and then link that to air pollution. And so there's a lot of data out there about that connections between the burning of fossil fuels, climate change, and then the impact of air pollution on young children. And I won't go into all of the details around it. I think it's quite similar. Young children are particularly vulnerable. They're smaller, they breathe more, they're outside, and so all of the things that we're talking about in terms of health impacts on trauma events and wars, those are also happening in terms of climate protection and air pollution. And then I think the last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of frame, and one that we see increasing, is not necessarily for young children, but for adolescents and young adults. And we're increasingly seeing a lot more research around the mental health impacts of climate change, and really not just the impact of it, but kind of the psychological experiences that young people are having around what is this impact going to be. And so a lot of the data kind of we look at has been coming out of and published in Lancet. We work really closely with organizations like the Climate Psychology Alliance. There's a fabulous researcher out in Bath in the UK called Carolyn Hickman. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is, like as an organization, is to kind of understand who the researchers are and who is really driving kind of the agenda around communication. And then as an organization, we work to try and translate that into like how do we then communicate to organizers and activists working in the field.
We do similar works as journalists, so I think we get it, and it's a difficult bridging that we got to do sometimes, but this is why you're great to tell us more about that. So we're obviously based in the US. Some of you you all work in the US. It doesn't mean that you're all just working on US issues. How do we have a room full of people from all over the world? How do the dynamics that you were addressing play out internationally in settings beyond the US? Kim, shall we start with you?
Sure, happy
over there?
to. Yeah, so it's clear that social supports and governmental benefits vary dramatically from one country to the next, right? Which can, of course, powerfully mitigate inequities. So, for example, to take one program or policy, the vast majority of countries globally have paid family leave or paid parental leave that's much more generous than what we have here in the U.S. So I looked up a statistic this morning from the International Labor Office, which said that more than 120 countries around the world provide paid maternity leave and health benefits by law, including most industrialized nations except Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S. So, and I think when you think about what does that actually mean, right? So there are many, many women here in the U.S. who have no paid leave whatsoever and are back at work literally a week or two after giving birth. I mean, and it's hard to imagine even just the physical toll of what that is like, let alone the emotional and mental, psychological toll that takes on mother and child. So when we think about the dramatic impact that systemic or structural governmental programs can have on the developing child very early in childhood, I think that is a sort of stark illustration of how government policies can play out differently across different countries.
Yeah, that makes I mean, that is always a very surprising piece of information about the U.S. and Australia and New Zealand. What about Brenda? What about how these racial inequities play at a more international sort of scale?
Yeah, I think we have learned some things about racial disparities in this country that can help. I think in particular, I'm thinking about sub-Saharan African nations. I mean, I'm obviously African American. That's where my ancestors are from. I like to think about what we do here helping those countries. And I think unlike the Western nations that Kim is talking about, there are some things that we've done here that I think are transferable. So for example, you all know we have a very strong early care and education program. Child care is another story. Let's put child care aside for a minute and think about things like Head Start and public pre-K, because our child care is dismal here, as you all know. But if you think about Head Start and public pre-K, there are some data that it's particularly useful for African American children. And you all, if you know anything about the history of Head Start, for example, you know it was really started in the Southern Black Belt, right? The first summer programs were in Mississippi, Alabama, those kinds of things. And we've learned some very interesting things. And I'm not saying that African American children are the same as children in other African nations. I mean, clearly our histories are very different in some pretty stark ways, but there's some data about how those kind of programs can support the early development of Black children that I think could be used in other nations. For example, sort of the comprehensive nature of the programs where you not just focus on school readiness in a narrow way where you're thinking about, ABCs, for example, but you're thinking about self-regulation. You're thinking about how to help children use their bodies in space. You're thinking about health outcomes, dental health outcomes. So I think those models are really transferable, and we've seen it happen with Caribbean nations where they've borrowed from us and done that kind of thing. Home visiting is another example. I never thought I'd see this in my lifetime, but we have a public national home visiting program in the United States. I mean, lots to be desired. We could argue, that there are things that it's not doing as well as it could be, but it's attempting to give young families the supports they need in the transition to parenthood. And one of the beautiful things that I think we've done is really think about cultural adaptation of those programs. So how do you deliver those to native populations? How do you deliver those to immigrant populations from East and West Africa? How do you deliver those to Latina populations? So I think we've learned how to make those tweaks by bringing in people from those cultures, by hiring them as the deliverers of home visiting services, that I think we could translate over. We've learned a lot about that and how to think about keeping the things that really work, but adapting the rest of it to what the lives are of people in other countries. So I think those are two examples of how we can do that. There's a lot other things we can think about in terms of public health initiative, micronutrients that, have been found to work across countries. But again, if you think about home visiting and Head Start, for example, both of those are supposed to be all-encompassing, so you can address these kind of health issues, mental health issues, all in the same way. So those are the ones that I think we can learn from. I would also say some of the stuff that we've done on infant mental health, Jane and I were talking about that here. We have a World Association of Infant Mental Health. As many of you know, Jane is funding people to come there from all over the place, a lot from countries, like she was telling me about South Africa, a lot from countries that don't typically come to Western kind of conferences and things like that. But I think what we're learning in that space, and you all might know that in the area of infant early childhood mental health, one of the primary reasons that we're delivering that in states is because of the expulsion of Black boys in particular from preschool programs. I'm sure you all have heard those data that Black boys have the highest rate of expulsion than anybody else, but particularly in preschool. So a lot of these infant and early childhood mental health programs have been established across states in the United States to address that issue. I think we can think about those kinds of things as well happening in other kinds of countries.
Thank you, Brenda. And I love that we're really getting into the solution side of things, which is one of the things that I think is very interesting for us journalists. Jill, coming to you. You guys, of course, work internationally. So how much does your narrative or what the examples that you're coming up with come from the international sphere?
Yeah, so just for clarity's sake, so I'm based in Brooklyn and live in New York City, but because of WhatsApp and Zoom and the internet, all of my work is global. And so I work with a global team based in the UK and Brazil. We also work with organizers in at least 10 or 15 other countries, Nigeria, South Africa, Mexico. So we collaboratively kind of work together and try and understand like the differences that there are both the similarities that are across geographies in terms of like organizing and climate communications, and then there's also a lot of differences. So I've spent the last kind of 8 years doing work, like global work, climate organizing work, and especially in the last 3 or 4. So on the kind of overall like similarities and the frames, I think what we're seeing that's been coming out, especially in the last year, is that the love for children and the care for future generations is the most inspiring and motivating frame on climate that exists anywhere. So there was a big study that came out a few months ago from an organization called Potential Energy, and they looked across 3 narrative frames in 23 countries, and that rose higher than any of the other frames, and so it beats out things like thinking about jobs. It beats out thinking about climate through inequality, even through air pollution and through extreme weather events. The idea of the love and care that people have for children and future generations is coming across as the most effective frame. There's another study that came out last month, and some of the work that I've been doing in the public engagement space on thinking about legacy and thinking about future generations came out as the most effective strategy for raising policy engagement and for getting people to think not just at the individual level, but how do we have an acceptance of policy and acceptance of change, and also how do we become more comfortable communicating. So I think, and that this is something I think from a research perspective that we've been seeing like over the last 8 years. It's becoming increasingly true that there's this idea of the care and concern of young children and also future generations that really dominates. However, the way that looks and how that's interpreted in different countries looks quite different. So, for example, like in New York City, that might be a group of moms who have young children who are out organizing, and they are doing play-ins and bringing them to political campaigns or officers, and they're asking their politicians to stop financing fossil fuels. That kind of organizing in campaigns doesn't necessarily translate across all contexts. And so, for example, we might see in South Africa, we might see that the idea, it's not necessarily the idea of parents, because it's not necessarily the parent who's the main caretaker. It might be elders and aunties. And so thinking about how we think about how different people across generations play different roles, and then understanding how those the similar frames and that similar connection between generations and love is there, but it might look quite different, like depending on the context. So we run a number of different programs. We have a fellowship program, we run a microgrants program, we do community organizing campaigns, and one of the things that's been really interesting, I think especially in the last 3 years as we've been developing this fellowship, is that we're starting to really understand the idea and have these really interesting conversations about what does it mean to have intergenerational kind of solidarity, intergenerational relationships, and then how do we let organizers and leaders in countries kind of make decisions around who then is part of our program. So we have a globally representative selection committee and interview committee to kind of then really understand like the differences and the nuances between geographies.
Thank you, Jill. And you mentioned the work of intergenerational sort of elements and how they play out, and I wonder, Kim, how that element plays out when we're talking about the effects of poverty on families and how that gets carried out through generations.
Absolutely. So there's no question that poverty is a vicious cycle, right? It's become increasingly clear that trauma really gets embedded in our very biology in a way that can be passed along to our offspring. So the relatively new field of epigenetics has really begun to shed some light on this. So epigenetics is the study of how experience changes the expression of our genes. So we're all born with all of the genes we'll ever have. We don't, barring sort of gene therapy type efforts, right? We're not really changing our genome per se, but our experiences change the extent to which our genes are turned on and off, and that's really happening at a day-to-day and even sort of minute-to-minute time frame. So it's very clear that our experiences can affect the extent to which different genes are turned on or off or expressed. And the best analogy I've heard is it's sort of like a dimmer switch, right? So most genes aren't like all on or all off, but are regulated. And part of that regulation has to do with what we're experiencing in the moment and over time. And what I think is particularly fascinating when thinking about this question of intergenerational transfer of trauma or adversity is that we can see epigenetic changes in a mom that then get passed on to her offspring. So she has changes in her gene expression as a result of experience, positive or negative, that then get passed on to children who never directly experienced those experiences, but are nonetheless sort of biologically embedded into those kids. So I think that's, certainly not the only mechanism by which there is intergenerational transfer of adversity, but it's sort of an explanation by which this happens, not only in terms of structural and systemic factors, but as a result of our biology itself.
Yeah, and Brenda, you were already sort of referring to it before, but what else?
Yeah, I can talk about intergenerational trauma, but I just want to say that the epigenetic data that Kim is talking about is like the most hopeful evidence that we've gotten out of medicine in generations, because what it suggests is that there is the possibility for change.
Yeah.
And I think as a clinician, I'm always reminding my students and supervisees about that even the epigenetic data tell us change can make a difference in terms of your gene expression. So then if that's the case, it can make a difference in terms of behavior. And if you look at the intergenerational trauma literature, maltreatment in particular, it says, yes, if you are a person who's experienced maltreatment, 90% of the time your caregiver has experienced trauma or maltreatment. But if you look at it the other way about the people who have experienced maltreatment and what they do to go on and parent their children, it's only about 30%. So that means there's a reason why 70%, the majority of people who've been victimized by maltreatment, don't go on and maltreat their own children. And that's what we need to find out. We don't need to keep sticking on, okay, we already know maltreatment begets maltreatment, and maltreatment begets bad outcomes. But what about that resilient group, if you want to use resilience, although I would argue that it's more than that, what can we learn about those families? And what we have learned is that they often have, just like the resilience literature says, somebody else who takes over, who gives them that responsive attachment experience that they can't get for their parents, which is why I often say, if I were a young clinician now, because I've been doing this for 4 decades, that I would be trying to get every one of the kids on my caseload in high quality child care. Notice I said high quality, not poor quality, mediocre quality that we see mostly, but high quality like Head Start and some of the programs, Educare, that we have in this country. Because while you're working with parents to hopefully improve their parenting, and we've got data now in this country that we can improve parenting, even for parents who are victims of trauma. So we can change the intergenerational cycle. We've got data that really intensive, brief, 8-week home visiting programs can improve parenting in some of these folks. We got the data, we got the programs, we just don't have the political will to scale them up, which is another problem, but we know what to do. And it is so exciting to me that we have interventions that can change them, but we also know what characterizes that 60%. If they have supportive spouses, for example, if they have a relationship with, a sibling, those kind of things matter. If they have, the ability to be reflective, those kinds of things matter. So all those things are important and we know about. And so I would hope that journalists would talk about that and not just about the, existence of intergenerational trauma. Now, I do ask a lot of questions about intergenerational trauma now in almost every study I do, whether it's an evaluation. I ask mothers to tell me about their own experiences, and just to show you that trauma does not always beget trauma. We have seen, not just in my work, but other people's work, that women who experience IPV, right, intimate partner violence, that combination with experience of child maltreatment is really, really hard. That because those women end up having relationships currently that are continually traumatizing, it really looks bad in terms of their parenting. But if you look at women who have experienced just intimate partner violence, who haven't experienced maltreatment, sometimes they'll try to compensate, and they're better parents because they are thinking about, oh my gosh, I'm staying with this partner who's exposing my child to current violence, I'm going to do even more to be the nurturing, supportive parent that I want to get. So, I mean, these are the kinds of data that come out of our field that, you know, aren't often reported in the newspaper. What's reported is, of course, you know, that trauma begets trauma. And I hope you all start to tell the broader story.
Yeah, and you know, you're mentioning the possibility of change, and that it is a possibility to change despite, you know, we're talking about very, very hopeless issues that seem that go way beyond our capability of acting. So I'd like to do just a round of answers on what are the solutions that are working in the topic that you're covering. Kim, I'll start with you in terms of, you know, what's working. What do we know that ends that vicious cycle of poverty?
Well, you know, calling back to the fact that we see great disparities globally in the kinds of services and benefits that governments provide. Certainly there are many governments out there that provide a credit to families, or you know, a monthly stipend to families when they have children to help support the economic needs of those children. The U.S. is historically not one of those countries. Historically, what we have had is something called the child tax credit, which many of you may be familiar with, which meant that up to a certain high income threshold, when you file your taxes, you would be able to get some money back if you have children. The problem is that historically, that only applied to individuals who earned enough money to owe federal income tax. And it turns out the poorest 25% of U.S. families don't owe enough money to don't earn enough money to owe income tax, and therefore didn't benefit from that credit. So what does that mean? A family like mine pays our taxes, we say that we have 2 children, and then we get money back that we can use however we please. No one asks any questions. A family that has much more limited economic resources might file their taxes but doesn't owe any money, and therefore does not benefit from that. Now, for 1 year in 2021, the Biden administration passed the American Rescue Plan, which one component of which was to make the child tax credit fully refundable, which isn't what it sounds like, at least to my non-economist mind. What that means is that during that time frame, all families up to a very high income threshold were able to benefit from the child tax credit regardless of whether they earned enough money to owe taxes. And during that 1 year, when the child tax credit was dramatically expanded, childhood poverty rates were cut in half. So in some ways, it's very straightforward. If you want to cut child poverty rates, you have to give people money. Now, Congress subsequently let that expansion of the child tax credit expire, and so no surprise, after it expired, child poverty rates rapidly rose up again.
Right, but we can see cash programs around the world. There's so much evidence, right, that they've worked in Brazil, for example, but also in many countries. So the U.S. is a bit behind on this.
A bit.
Yeah.
A bit. Jill, solutions, climate.
Are we winning on climate? Probably, well, maybe. So, I mean, I think I've done climate, like organizing communications for almost 20 years. And I think the first at least 15 of those years, I was incredibly struggling with this idea of no one is talking about climate. It's invisible. We know the impacts are already happening. We know the science, yet it wasn't part of the public discourse. It wasn't reported in media. And so I think, in the kind of 2017, 2018, and then in the wave of the youth strikes, there has been a huge shift, I think, in terms of public perception and just at least our understanding and willingness to engage on climate. So in terms of from a communications perspective, I think we've come a really long way. I think in terms of a technology perspective, we also have come a very long way, and we actually do have the technologies available to transition. I also think we have the policies. So then people are always like, well, what really is missing? If we have the technology and we have the policies, the policy ideas, like, why aren't we aren't changing our behavior necessarily, we aren't changing our infrastructure, we aren't changing our policies at the rate and level that we need to. And so I really think the most kind of important work that's out there right now that I think the field is really starting to understand is like how to build the political will on climate. So this, I think, is where like reporting and journalism, I think, plays a really, really critical role. And in really integrating and thinking about not just reporting on the extreme weather events and the, you know, the bad things that are happening, because that leads people to feel like completely overwhelmed and kind of feel like there's this doomerism. So I think we have this, in the next 5 years, we have like two big like meta conversations that we could have in like globally, in the United States, but also globally. One is that it's too late. Like, there's nothing people can do, it's too big, it's too overwhelming, it's too late. And I think there's a lot of people out there who are vested in interests that you start to see that narrative coming through. Instead of people denying climate change, they are moving into this, it's too big, it's too late, it's too expensive kind of frame. But there is this other like narrative, I think, that's beginning to gain shape. And that is like, we have the solutions, we have the ability to do this, and we can really do this. And so I think, as maybe I'm just like pleading to you guys as journalists, is really to think about, when you're writing things, is what's being written, does it have a piece within it that allows for the solutions to come through, to give agency to people, to get people to feel like, not that there's like this just like hope in the world that like it just exists, but that they can actually be agents of change, and that people doing work on climate and people acting together actually really does matter. And so I actually think, I mean, I've been doing this so long, I think we've made a huge amount of progress. I think there's so much longer to go, but I think the kind of critical narratives are, as I said, like around we can do this. If we don't believe that like a different world is possible and that we can get towards it, we'll never get there.
Thank you. And Brenda, you mentioned a bit Head Start. You started talking a bit about solutions. But when it comes to solutions of how poverty affects, about how racism affects the youngest and their families.
Yeah, I'm going to answer that, but I want to just also
Please.
build on a little bit that Kim says, because Kim always, motivates me to think more. But Lonnie Berger has also been looking at these income supports that Kim was talking about, child tax credit, but also expanded TANF, Medicaid. And they have found in states where there are these income safety nets, you can also reduce some child maltreatment. So you can reduce child poverty, but you can also reduce child maltreatment. And I think that's really important data that needs to be out there. So thank you for letting me say that. But in terms of reduction of racial disparities, I guess there are a couple things I want to say. I think that we really start to see them in this country, at least, just like we see the SES disparities really in the first 3 years of life. So Chuck's point this morning about plasticity of the brain, if you look at the economists' graphs, they look exactly the same, that you get more return on your investment if you are doing it in the first few years of life. And I would argue the same for some of the race-based interventions, that if you really want to try to address the higher risk that Black children, Latino children, and some Asian groups in this country, because Asian is not Asian, right? If you want to really address that, you don't want to wait until kids get to school. You want to do it in the first few years of life. I would argue through comprehensive early care and education programs, not what pre-K is, which ends up being, unfortunately, in our country, a lot of rote learning around phonemic awareness, which I would say has helped our children certainly with reading, but of course that, and Chuck talked about it, how we lose the effects once they get to school. Because public school in this country, which is why I was so happy that Kim said her kids were getting a good public school experience. You all know public school in the U.S. is really based on neighborhood and tax bases in local places. So it ends up children get very, very different experiences, and Black kids in particular, I know mostly about Black kids, but Latina children, you can say the same thing about, end up in segregated schools with fewer resources. So all that work we've put in them in the first few years of life goes away once they hit public schools. Now, the good news is that when you look at these programs, kids who go into these early care and education programs that are comprehensive, you do see better outcomes in early adulthood, like less jail time, less special education placement, more likely graduate from high school. So these kind of life course variables, at least from the programs that started, you know, a few decades ago, you do see this kind of U-shaped curve where the effects go away in elementary school and high school, but once you get to emerging adulthood, they start to look better. So I'm hopeful that we'll see some of the same things with some of our newer programs, but the point I'm trying to make is they need to be comprehensive, which all the data suggests. You can't just focus on reading, writing, arithmetic. You got to focus on kids' physical health. You got to focus on their mental health. They need to start, hopefully, in the perinatal period, not waiting until even kids are born, because you all heard the data about infant mortality, et cetera. And they need to really be very targeted, very targeted. So although you're trying to address every domain, you got to think about, what do we know that works to get kids' language up? What do we know that works to, you know, make mothers who are depressed, because you know the depression rate goes up during the early years, to make them more responsive to those children. So you have to really connect the data and really deliver these interventions that are modular. You know, like what some of the home visiting programs have done is like layer on doulas, or layer on you know, interventions for depressed moms as a way to make sure you're addressing those risk factors. And then you end up getting much better outcomes. So once children hit the public school, at least they've got some grounding. And there is some data that really shifting parents in that transition to parenthood, what happens in the first few years of life, really helps them to hold their children together and keep them from having the negative outcomes that we see in a lot of these communities in adolescence and beyond.
Thank you. I'd love to open it up. I see a bunch of hands raised, and you'll get a mic in a second.
Sometimes in our bid to report on these issues, we try to find a way not to traumatize people who are already traumatized, like traumatize them more. And there's this concept about asset framing. You know, I want to find out from the panelists whether they think it's something that as journalists we can, you know, adopt in the way we carve the narrative. Then secondly, we know that, I think you addressed it, but I still want to pick your thoughts. When it comes to global carbon emissions, US and China have the biggest license. Africa's contribution is just negligible, but you realize that over the years, the investment and the support that has gone to Africa is largely in the area of mitigation. There's a lot that we need in the area of adaptation, and that's how communities can build resilience, you know, in terms of irrigation projects, drought-resistant agriculture, and so on and so forth. And that, to a large extent, helps to reduce the impact of climate change on the communities. But funding is not coming in that area. As part of the solution, what would you suggest? Thank you.
That's another climate question.
That's another climate question. You can.
Yeah, I can. I mean, I totally hear you. I mean, I think on climate change, we both need the mitigation and we need the adaptation. Without the mitigation piece, if we just focus on adaptation, we will never stop. If we don't turn the tap off, it will just continue running, and the kinds of things we need to adapt to and the amount of money and change that will happen because of a not stopping the problem will continue. So I think from the way that we think about it, and we work with organizers all over the globe, some who are very, very focused on the mitigation side of calling on energy companies and banks, and asking for like a change, whether it's the energy sector, the transportation sector, the agriculture sector, to make change. then I think we are seeing lots of interest and lots of organizing around in adaptation coming from the global south, and particularly from Africa. And I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. It's like people who are not the cause are being more impacted, more heavily impacted, and then the kinds of work that people want to do, the organizing work, and the money and resources that are needed are on adaptation and are on loss and damage, which is how do we pay for the damages that are already built in. So it's not just about how do we become more resilient or how do we make the changes, but how are there actually like financial, like money that is transferred, the transfer of wealth, so that the people who are most impacted, particularly in from the global south, are given the space to change the kind of infrastructure and that is needed in terms of addressing climate change. So I think I see that there's a need for both work around the mitigation side and the adaptation side, and a lot of what we do is try and understand from organizers and leaders themselves is like not saying like everyone needs to work on the same strategies, but understanding that different strategies happen in different contexts because it's very context specific.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Ridwan, maybe your other part about traumatizing and interviews we can get into tomorrow, because we're going to be looking a lot at it with Kate Porterfield. So maybe hold on to that. Who's the next? Who's there? Jenny. And then we'll...
Hi there. My name is Jenny, and I'm with the LA Times. And Dr. Hardin, you really caught my ear with your comment that what we need is high-quality childcare of the sort that Head Start provides, but not of the sort that a public pre-K program might provide. And I just want to ask you a little bit more about that. I'm in a state where we are in the midst of a massive expansion of our public we call it TK, but it's basically a pre-kindergarten program, and it's something that other states are trying out as well. And I'm wondering whether you think that's a workable solution, whether those states like mine are heading in the wrong direction, whether these might be for kids in of different poverty levels. Like this is something I cover, and I'm also a parent of a child in TK, and phonemic awareness, and those are sort of the elements that are part of the curriculum. I just wonder if you could speak a little bit more to.
See, fortunately, I don't work for the government, so I can say what I want to say. I work in academia. I'm not saying we shouldn't do public pre-K. I think, I'm from D.C. and live in New York, and D.C. and New York, as you know, have had one of the biggest, although we're moving back in New York, I don't know if you all have heard, but biggest sort of universal pre-K initiatives. So here's my concern. One, that a lot of money is going to middle class and upper class parents that I'd rather see go to families from low income backgrounds. And a lot of my colleagues totally disagree with me. They think that a universal approach is what you do to get a country as heterogeneous as ours behind a concept. And I think they're right, but it just makes me mad that somebody in DC making $1 million a year can get free public pre-K. It just makes me mad when there's so many low-income children who need services. So that's one problem I have. My second problem is that it is very much focused on these narrow school readiness goals, like reading. And the truth is, what we know about middle class children, they don't benefit as much as low income children. So I just want to put that out there, because their families are taking them to the museum on the weekends and reading to them at night, etc. So they're going to get it either way. So I do think children from low-income and minoritized backgrounds need this extra didactic push. I agree. So I'm happy about that, but I think it's very narrow. So for example, we did a study of public pre-K in Baltimore City, which was not universal. It was just for the kids who got, they were low-income children in low-income neighborhoods. And yes, public pre-K improved their reading, improve their alphabet knowledge, improve their applied problems from the math perspective, did not improve their executive functioning, and there's a lot more more of a lack of clarity in the data about whether public pre-K can do that. And if you think about what executive functioning is, that's that stuff that Chuck was talking about in the frontal lobe, these not academic focused skills, but sustained attention, working memory, problem solving, all self-regulation, all that kind of stuff that even Kim was talking about relates to children's school readiness outcomes. And I feel like a lot of pre-K programs don't address that. They're so focused on making sure the children can pass the doggone school readiness tests where they can show that they've got pre-literacy skills, that the skills we know will get children to college and get them to get a college degree, that's not what they're getting. And I think that's another reason why in the pre-K data we're losing out. If you look at the higher quality programs like Head Start, and I don't know if you have been paying attention, but Head Start's enrollments are going down, partly because of public pre-K, and I have lots of opinions about that. I think, the federal government should think about really making it a 0 to 3 program and using that money so we won't get in trouble and lose the Head Start dollars. But I also think we could be adding to pre-K that really is focused on those academic skills and having more for children where they learn about social emotional skills, how to relate to others, how to be regulated human beings, how to be fair and kind human beings that could really help them along the way. So that's...
You mean in the public pre-K?
Yeah, you could. So, like in a lot of public pre-K, they don't have the time to do that because the curriculum is such that you got to work on math block and you got to work on the literacy block. So I'm saying you could, and some jurisdictions already do this. They braid the funds, right? So they take public pre-K dollars, they take Head Start dollars, they take child care dollars, and they offer, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. programming where they use these other dollars to support, the things that pre-K can't do. So I think that's another way to think about the money, but we're still, fighting. Everybody wants to keep their little pot, so that becomes a problem. So,
right. And like, I guess to broaden it out internationally, this conflict between, what should be on the curriculum and how to do kind of school readiness versus emotional skills is a thing that plays out internationally in a lot of the sort of preschool systems. But here it has also other components that are quite charged. So thank you for that. Mariah, and then we'll take maybe, Rupsha. Okay, Mariah and then Rupsha.
This is a question for Doctors Hardin and Noble. So I'm really interested in writing about kids in poverty, and I really appreciate all the data about their, poorer outcomes, about the brain science, but there's still this notion in this country that poverty is an individual problem and that people are in poverty because they're morally or intellectually or biologically deficient. And so I'm curious to know, first of all, what we know. I know you said that we're still trying to tease out the experiences of poverty that lead to these changes. But so what do we know about the experiences, and how do we as journalists avoid either falling back on lazy explanations or contributing to this idea that people in poverty are fundamentally different from middle-class people?
I love this question and would be happy to answer it first. A few things. I think, part of shifting the spotlight onto children helps to mitigate against that blaming the victim mentality, right? For better or for worse, there are people in this country who are very happy to blame adults for their circumstances in life. I think it is much more difficult to blame children for their circumstances in life. So I think that's one answer. Then to address the brain specifically, I think this is one of the greatest pitfalls I've seen when working with journalists, right? I think many scientists even, hear brain and think we're talking about something innate or predetermined or, not immutable, unable to be changed, right? And neuroscience is all about how none of that is true, right? And I know you guys have heard lots about brain plasticity and brain malleability to experience, right? So what that means is that when we're showing associations between poverty or other adverse experiences and kids' brains, right? We're not saying these individuals are fundamentally different or fundamentally damaged, right? Or are predestined to have different outcomes in life. It means that their experiences have shaped their brain development, and that in turn, that means that changing those experiences could set people on a different path. And then the other thing I just want to say on this is that lately, neuroscience has sort of recognized that a lot of the framing we have done as scientists has led to this idea of sort of pathologizing people in poverty or facing other adversities. And, in many ways, I think our framing is somewhat inaccurate in that it's not necessarily that we're talking about experiences that are causing detrimental outcomes, right? The brain in some ways is neutral, right? It's sort of responding to the environmental inputs that it's getting, and it optimizes its performance, its development for those inputs. So one example that I use in my classes, there was one of the very first studies that looked at socioeconomic disparities and children's brain function. It was a study of young kids, like 3 to 8 year olds, and they played different storybooks in like one story in one ear and one story in another ear. And they told the kids, pay attention to the story in this ear and ignore the story in that ear. Okay, so kids were paying attention. And then afterwards, and while they were doing this, they were sort of measuring their brain activity to the two different stories. And they asked them questions about their comprehension of the story they were supposed to be paying attention to. And they brought in kids from socioeconomically diverse homes. What they found was that everybody was pretty good at answering the questions, so they were comprehending it pretty well. But when they looked on the neural level, what they saw is that kids from more advantaged backgrounds showed more brain activity to the story they were supposed to pay attention to, and less brain activity to the story they were not supposed to pay attention to. Whereas the kids from disadvantaged backgrounds showed more equal brain activity to both. Okay, so one explanation or framing of that finding is that, well, if you're from a more advantaged background, you're able to pay better attention to the thing you're told to pay attention to. Or, the flip side of that same frame would be kids from disadvantaged backgrounds aren't able to suppress information that they're not supposed to be, unnecessary or irrelevant information. That was how the authors framed it and how it has largely been interpreted. Another equally valid potential interpretation, right, is that we adapt to our experiences. And so if you are in an environment where it makes sense to keep one proverbial eye on your surroundings, right? Maybe it doesn't make sense to only focus on the thing that's in front of you. Maybe it does make sense to keep some attention reserved for other so-called irrelevant information because it might become very relevant, right? That would make one adapt and seem to pay sort of less selective attention to the task at hand, right? And so it might be that it's an adaptive outcome, not necessarily a pathological one.
Okay.
Not necessarily like a negative one.
Exactly. No, right, adaptive and beneficial.
Okay. Would you like something?
I agree with everything that, I love that example. I'm going to use that.
Yeah, I'll send you the paper.
Thank you.
I'm not in the field, and I love this.
Yeah, I want
example.
So the only thing I'll add is about, who the face of poverty is. And I think about what happened with the opioid epidemic. And once we found out that white poor families were using opioids, then we started having more money for drug use and, drug abuse programs. So I think similarly for poverty, I mean, the truth is, you all know the data that there are more white families who are poor than black families. So I'm looking at this from a race perspective, but when you look at pictures in the paper or stories, it's about the black mom in the inner city who is single and blah, blah, blah. If we sort of went to West Virginia, right, and looked at some of that poverty, it is horrendous. It's really, really scary to think about kids living in the predicaments that they're living in West Virginia and Kentucky and places like that. And I remember always thinking this, I shouldn't get political, but when the senator from West Virginia was doing what he was doing, I was like, what about your families in your state? So I would love to see those stories be told, and I think it might help the group of people who are assuming, because race is always an issue in this country at least, that poverty means these lazy black families who don't work and who are welfare queens, the narrative, which is crazy because of course TANF has changed and these moms aren't just getting free welfare anymore. But I think if you did stories on a different kind of poverty, what it means to be a poor white family in Maine, what it means to be a poor white family in Appalachia, I think that could change how people view it, and certainly would make certain legislators be more likely to support, these kind of income supports that we're talking about.
And thank you for that, Brenda. I know there are other questions from the public, but we need to wrap it up. So we're going to have a break now. I just want to end on this great thought of how we journalists can reframe and rethink with the data that we have, with the information and the data that comes from all the research, the way we address issues. And that's a very important reminder of the work that we can do and have to do to reframe things so that maybe some solutions can be achieved. Thank you so much for this great panel. And please take a break and be back in 10. Thank you.